So we have here an outline of the main ideas and the details from what you were supposed to have learned about the French and Indian War. We're going to connect that with the fact that the American Revolutionary War ended up with the United States no longer colonies of England. And we can see the first event that happens here is the French and Indian War. You have a piece of paper that looks like this. First thing we're going to do is color code this because I want you to begin seeing the connection between the main ideas and everything that's indented underneath it is a detail that tells more about that main idea. So don't color so darkly that you cannot read the words underneath it, but you do need to see, yep, our first main idea is about a historical event. The second main idea is a fact that England spent lots of money. Why did they spend lots of money? To win. So these two facts are telling us more about this main idea, that this is a fact. Then, following that fact, we have a consequence. The consequence of the fact before it is that Parliament increased English taxes. Why? Because they needed to pay the debt. One of the ways that Parliament increased English taxes was the Stamp Act. It was a law that said the colonies, it was a law that impacted the colonies, and it said they had to pay a tax as well. We're going to go look at the book in a moment to find out more about that, but this is just a bit of a preview. What resulted then from the Stamp Act? The idea that colonists had to pay taxes too. The colonists responded. How? They got together to complain. They called this gathering the Stamp Act Congress, and they had groups of people that were not just mad about the Stamp Act. They got together and called themselves the Sons of Liberty. Finally, because of those responses, the Stamp Act was repealed. It was no longer a law. But, so there's not really any details about this, so we're not going to color that. But here we go. Here's our last main idea. Mother England is not just going to let this go. It's kind of like a 2-year-old rolling around on the floor in the store because mom says she won't get the candy the 2-year-old wants. In this case, Mother England thinks these colonies were behaving very inappropriately by complaining about stamp taxes. So Mother England says, okay, you don't have to pay the stamp tax, but we're going to make new taxes. You will now have to pay taxes on fabric and tea and lead and paint and sugar and lots of other stuff. And what are we going to do to make sure that you pay those taxes? We are going to send more soldiers to the colonies. So make sure that this is color-coded so that you can see the main idea and the detail is indented underneath it. Here's a main idea, 2 details indented underneath it. It is important to be able to understand the way outlines are set up, and that's one sort of side skill that you get while we talk about the Revolutionary War. This sheet of notes needs to be taped down. Just tape the top side, and it needs to be on page 4. At some point today would be a good idea to go through, in fact, and number each page at least up to 10. I wouldn't suggest numbering all of the pages because as we go along, you might find that you didn't turn pages correctly, but number it through page 10. French and Indian War is written on page 4, so we'll go back to the table of contents. We have information about the French and Indian War on page 4. We might have information on the next page, so don't fill this entirely up, but make sure you say, yep, we're starting on page 4 with information about the results of the French and Indian War. Now, the next bit that I want to do is show you where this is considered in the social studies book. So if we start on page 92, it is the idea of liberty and the fact that the colonists did not like it when the British government, when Mama England was telling them where they could not live, where they could not go. Kind of like people are a little bit angry about the government saying we can't go places and do things now, right? In this case, on top of that, there was a new tax. And because of those ideas, because of the ideas that the colonists felt the government was taxing them and telling them they couldn't go places without listening to them, they said taxation without representation is tyranny. It's abuse of power. And so the colonies started to rebel. When you rebel, it's when you refuse to obey the people who are in charge. Specifically, we have the Stamp Act over here. The Stamp Act was just mentioned a little bit in your outline. It was a law that said the colonies had to pay taxes specifically on paper. And so a newspaper, a pamphlet, a signed legal document, a marriage license. If you wanted to get married, you had to pay the tax. If you graduated, you had to pay the tax. If you bought a pack of playing cards, you were supposed to buy a stamp that represented the fact that you had paid the tax. At this point, one of the more famous people who spoke up about the unfairness of this tax, his name was Patrick Henry. He was a member of the House of Burgesses in Virginia. This should sound familiar because the House of Burgesses began all the way back during Jamestown. What year was Jamestown? 1607. We are now more than 100 years later. And so Patrick Henry gave a famous speech against the Stamp Act. We had groups of people, groups of colonists taking part in what were called the Sons of Liberty. They were groups of colonists who organized protests against the British government. Another famous fellow whose name is going to come up again was Samuel Adams. He was one who organized the first group, Sons of Liberty, in Boston. One thing that the Sons of Liberty did, it says they organized protests. And so this is a picture of a rally protesting the Stamp Act. We do know what the stamp looked like as well. I'll show you a photograph in a bit. You can go to museums. In the one that I saw was in Boston, and they have actual stamps from that time in cases that people like me can't touch, but still you can see the stamps. What happened as a result of all of these rebellions and speeches? Well, the stamp tax agents, the people who were supposed to collect the tax and give out the stamps, got so freaked out that in almost every city they quit their jobs. And so Parliament was the group of lawmakers in England. Parliament in England decided, okay, we don't want to get the colonies upset. We will repeal the Stamp Act. And so after a year of all of this back and forth rebellion, the Stamp Act was repealed. But Parliament over in England wasn't ready to give up as soon as they repealed the Stamp Act, they passed the Townsend Acts. These were just more taxes. Taxes on fabric, tea, lead, paint, and sugar. They sent more soldiers to the colonies. And today I'm going to leave you with the thought of, oh dear, what is going to happen with extra soldiers being sent to the colonies to gather this new tax? The first tax, the stamp tax, it didn't go so well. Now we're sending soldiers to gather it. This video is going to be a review also of how the French and Indian War led to these taxes.
Away to fight a war that small nations might be free. Got the soldier's gun and uniform to fight the enemy.
The French and Indian War. What you need to know. The French and Indian War is the name Americans gave to the 7 Years' War. The war was fought between the colonies of British America and New France for control of much of the North American continent. Colonists used the name French and Indian War due to the primary enemies they faced: Royal French forces and Native American Indian tribes who allied with the French. The war was fought mostly along the frontier areas separating New France and the British North American colonies. It began as a dispute in the Ohio River Valley region after French forces established Fort Duquesne in what the British considered their territory. Virginia forces under the command of George Washington were sent to force the French out, thus igniting the conflict. The French won a series of victories in the war's early stages, due in large part to the success of General Louis Joseph de Montcalm. Yet, as the war dragged on, the French commander found himself short of manpower and resources. Montcalm set up defenses inside Quebec, a commanding position overlooking the St. Lawrence River. The tide of the war began to turn because William Pitt had been named Prime Minister of Britain. Pitt, fully committed to victory, threw Britain into heavy debt trying to win the war. He convinced the colonies to provide more troops and money to the cause, and British forces captured Duquesne, renaming it Fort Pitt in his honor. Today, we call it Pittsburgh. The crucial year came in 1759 when British General James Wolfe forced a decisive battle with Montcalm that changed the course of the war. The Battle of Quebec was very brief, but the future of Canada, Britain, France, and the unborn United States was decided in less than 15 minutes. It is commonly cited as one of the most important battles in history, as it ended 150 years of bloody strife for control of North America. As a result, the French had to give up much of their land claims to North America as part of the Treaty of Paris in 1763. The war had vast economic, political, and governmental and societal ramifications for Britain, France, and Spain, as well as the colonists and numerous Native American Indian tribes inhabiting the territories claimed by these nations. The French and Indian War almost doubled Britain's national debt, and King George III, seeking sources of revenue to pay off the £133 million cost, determined to impose new taxes on the colonies to help pay for the war.
So you're going to have an assignment tomorrow that requires you to think like a colonist. And you will have to include why you are being forced to pay these new taxes. If you didn't catch it, rewind this video a little bit. I've mentioned it several times. It is on your notes, but where this video was just talking, it reminds you once more why these new taxes had been made.
These attempts were met by very stiff resistance in the American colonies, and decisions made by King George III, the British Parliament, and colonial leaders would eventually lead to the outbreak of the Revolutionary War.
I went away to fight a war that small nations might be free.
And I did want you to see that much in case you thought I made that video. I did not. So we'll give credit to that person. This is in a museum in Boston. Right here are 3 of the stamps that were supposed to have been sold as part of the stamp tax. This looks a little bit blurry because I had to zoom in so much because I was surprised when I saw them. These are rather small. So that gives you an idea of the connection between the French and Indian War and the beginning of the American Revolution. Do be sure that your Revolutionary War booklet has your notes color-coded like this, taped in on page 4. Make sure that page 5 is empty. You will be writing on that tomorrow.